History as it happens, June 23, 2022. Vladimir Putin, the fascist?
Delle decisioni irrevocabili.
Vor sich hertragen und wir werden in unserem Zeichen wieder siegen.
Mussolini and Hitler were the 20th century's most infamous fascist leaders. But fascism didn't disappear forever in 1945, even if we have trouble defining what it means today. One major historian says Russia's invasion of Ukraine is fascist, and that Vladimir Putin, whose brother died in the Nazi siege of Leningrad, is a fascist himself. Why does it matter what we call him? That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Уважаемые граждане России, дорогие ветераны, товарищи.
Fascism is a political ideology whose mythic core, I'll come back to all these things, in its various permutations, is a palingenetic form of populist ultra-nationalism.
Yale's Timothy Snyder is a highly regarded scholar of European history. He writes in a New York Times op-ed, "Fascism is impossible to define satisfactorily. People disagree," he says, often vehemently over what constitutes fascism. But today's Russia meets most of the criteria that scholars tend to apply. It has a cult around a single leader, Vladimir Putin. It has a cult of the dead, organized around World War II. It has a myth of a past golden age of imperial greatness to be restored by a war of healing violence, the murderous war on Ukraine, writes Timothy Snyder of Yale. He also says we're wrong to limit our fears of fascism to a certain image of Hitler and the Holocaust. And he's got a point there. If one needs to be another Hitler in order to meet the definition of fascism, you won't find any more fascists. But we can also go wrong if we broaden the definition. That's because things like racism, aggressive war, mass murder, genocide, while practiced by fascist governments in the 20th century, are not unique to fascism. In other words, an attempt to clearly define what's going on in the world right now can lead to more confusion. I mean, just look at Donald Trump, who is called a fascist by some of his critics. Or at the very least, he embraced the fascist style in politics, the grievance, the large rallies, promises to restore national greatness. And of course, Trump gave his critics plenty of ammo, like when he retweeted a Mussolini quote. He was asked about that by Chuck Todd on NBC's Meet the Press.
Do you like the quote? Did you know it was Mussolini?
It's okay to know it's Mussolini. Look, Mussolini was Mussolini. It's okay to. It's a very good quote. It's a very interesting quote, and I know it. I saw it. I saw what, and I know who said it. But what difference does it make whether it's Mussolini or somebody else? It's certainly a very interesting quote.
And the quote was, "It is better to live one day as a lion than 100 years as a sheep." Now, Trump shared something in common with Mussolini. He knew how to delight a crowd. And that doesn't make him a fascist. Politicians of all ideological persuasions have delivered stem-winding speeches. But there is something awe-inspiring, if not rather unsettling, about the way 20th century fascists stage-managed a rally or a ceremony. Maybe that can explain what fascism is, the way its adherents manifest their ideas. Watch Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, or look at footage of the 1936 Nuremberg rally on YouTube. The massive, coordinated crowds, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, standing ramrod straight, extending their arms in their Heil Hitler. The flags, the symbols, the music, the speeches. It's all meant to evoke a sense that the nation is creating history anew. Well, that was on May 9th. Vladimir Putin spoke at the annual military parade in Red Square, commemorating the Soviet Union's victory over the Nazis.
Товарищи офицеры, генералы и адмиралы, поздравляю вас.
Now, it looked like something from the fascist playbook, the soldiers, the pageantry, the memorializing of fallen heroes. But that doesn't make Putin or Russia fascist. Roger Griffin is Emeritus Professor in Modern History at Oxford Brookes University. He is the author of The Nature of Fascism, a seminal work written in the early 1990s, and more recently, Fascism, An Introduction to Comparative Fascist Studies. And that book deals with the problem that the word fascism has become a catch-all term of abuse for figures on the political right. Roger Griffin, welcome to the podcast. It is an honor to have you.
Thank you very much. Honor to be here.
So you feeling the pressure these days with all this talk of fascism? You have reporters like me reaching out to you. You never heard of me before, asking you to come on my podcast and explain it all.
I owe the perpetuation of my career to the intrusion of contemporary history. I mean, fascism for a long time I was actually told when I started my doctorate in the 1980s that it was pointless studying fascism because it was history. It had finished in 1945 and who cares about what it means, etc. And then when populism came up in France in the Front National and Le Pen and all that, people started saying that was fascist. So some people started asking me then, is Le Pen a fascist, etc. Then a thing called the Nouvelle Droite, the new right, came up, French intellectuals criticizing the multicultural society, and people started throwing that label. And it seems obscene to say this, but 9/11 really revitalized the whole question of fascism. You had Bush calling ISIS, or at the time Al-Qaeda, Islamofascism, and people started sticking the word fascism onto radical Islam. And then, of course, we got the rise of what I call illiberal nationalism, people like Modi and Bolsonaro, and especially Putin. And then, of course, a wonderful fillip to my whole career, Trump,
yes,
causing the term fascism to be bandied around extensively. And so, in a way, I've been kept in business by the continual idea that maybe we're witnessing a rise of fascism, or that the latest opponent of liberal democracy was a fascist. And when Trump left off, Putin took his place. So I paradoxically and perversely owe it to these people who want to destroy democracy or pervert it that I'm still not history myself.
I suppose we can take a narrow definition or a broader one. My understanding until recently was that fascism was a 20th century thing, but we're going to get to that. But first, for those who may not be familiar with your decades of work on this subject, I'd like for you to briefly explain how you approach the study of fascism. It's not simply a historical analysis. You are multidisciplinary, right?
Well, that's a euphemism for saying I'm a jack of all trades and that I don't really know anything properly. I do have a place, though. I mean, one of the reasons why some academics, especially in my own hometown of Oxford, reject my credentials as an expert is that I actually did French and German literature at university. I have no qualifications in political science or political studies at all, except that I did what we call a Doctor of Philosophy, a DPhil, or PhD, it's normally known, in Oxford. And by then it was a broadly speaking political science doctorate, but I approached it from a very particular angle, because what I got used to at Oxford University, where you have to be a speed reader. I mean, you're set an essay to do in 2 days, like compare the novels of Balzac and Zola, who between them wrote about 27 major novels. And so you either get very drunk or you actually try to find a source which summarizes all these different novels, and you might read a few chapters of a couple of them, but if you tried to actually read them all, you'd go mad. So what you do is you get very good at sampling the worldview or the aesthetic or the style or whatever, or the age that you see in the pages of a book that you haven't really read. So when I was challenged, and I could give you a long story about why, but the shorthand is that I was working at Oxford Brookes University in the history of ideas, and we had a new head of department, an American, a wonderful guy called Robert Murray, who'd actually fought fascism, fighting his way up the Italian peninsula in the Second World War, and still didn't understand what he'd been fighting. He'd gone back to university after the war, got more and more interested in what fascism was, but still didn't have a definition. And so he decided to run a course on defining fascism, but there was no center to this course because when I was helping to teach it, nobody had yet sorted out a definition. This was the mid-80s. So when I became a failed poet and a failed playwright, I decided to actually give up trying to be creative, because I still didn't have a doctorate, I decided to set about writing a doctorate which would produce a usable, working definition of fascism, not an absolute or definitive one, but just one that scholars like me could use so that they didn't waste all their time trying to define the blooming thing. By the time I started this doctorate, I'd already read a lot of fascists. Now, I'd already got French and German, and I could read Spanish, and my new wife, my lovely wife, was Italian, and I started reading Mussolini, and her father had actually been in the fascist war in northern Italy, etc. So I actually got very interested, and I very quickly saw that if you actually read fascist leaders like Primo de Rivera in Spain or Hitler or Mussolini, even though they were very, very different, there was a pattern that I saw that showed what they thought fascism was. And what I realized was that neither Marxists nor non-Marxists actually bothered to ask fascists what fascism was. It was a bit like early psychology or psychiatry studies where nobody actually asked the patient what they were going through. They stuck labels on them without actually talking to them about their own reality. So I decided basically to make how fascists saw fascism the basis of a definition. It nearly got rejected by a very eminent professor called Professor Durrendorf in Oxford University. It was salvaged by Ian Kershaw, who's the most eminent historian of Nazism and Hitler. And because of that, I just by the skin of my teeth got a doctorate. And then I was invited to turn that doctorate into a book, which nearly got remaindered, but for a quirk of fate.
I think I'm holding that book in my hand right now, The Nature of Fascism.
That book in paperback edition started very slowly to make waves. And in the last 25 years, I have carried on in that groove. But what has been very heartening is that especially a younger generation of scholars have been studying their own examples of the far right in their own history, in Hungary, in Slovakia, in Japan, in India. Only today I was reading an article about fascism in India, and it uses my definition. So it's nothing to do with me, but the definition based on how fascists themselves saw fascism has proved to be the basis of an increasingly refined and applied generic definition.
It's arguably the most difficult political idea, political ideology to define. I mean, most ideologies, liberalism, socialism, fascism, mean different things to different people at different times in history. And then, of course, they get politicized and they're used as slurs to denigrate one's political opponents. But even among professional academics such as yourself, there's been an enormous debate going on for decades. So I was going to ask you first, is Putin a fascist? Yes or no? Which is a very, very fascist way of...
He's not a fascist, but I have to be a lawyer and say, but it depends what you mean by fascist.
Before we get to Putin, why don't I ask you to offer the Roger Griffin definition of fascism?
Yeah. There's a Woody Allen joke about the meaning of life. And he asked his rabbi, is there a meaning to life? And the rabbi said there is, but it only makes sense in Hebrew. And then he wants $10 an hour to teach him the Hebrew. And I have a single sentence definition of fascism, but it takes a whole chapter and maybe even a whole book to actually explain what it means. So I'll give you the cryptic one sentence definition, which I hope will not be a trigger to all your listeners to turn off the radio or their iPhone. And it goes as follows, and I'll unpack it briefly. Okay, so fascism is a political ideology whose mythic core, I'll come back to all these things, in its various permutations, is a palingenetic form of populist ultra-nationalism, by which point the mind turns off. So let's go through that. For a very long time, historians and academics denied that fascism had an ideology. It was psychotic, it was evil, it was like an emotional fever, it was nihilistic, it just wanted to destroy. It was just like the vandalism of a psycho burning cars or something. So fascism had no ideology. So my starting point is that fascism is like liberalism, conservatism, feminism, etc. That the ism in these cases actually points to an ideological core, a fundamental cause, which you can define in different ways. But in socialism, there's some idea of social equality. In liberalism, there's some idea of freedom, etc., etc. And so the task was to find out what the core of fascism was. So this was the basis of my definition, that every ideology has what I call a mythic core. That is the utopian goal it sets itself. Well, I define what that goal is on the basis of having read all these fascists. And this is the palingenesis of the nation. Now, let's call it rebirth. Let's call it revolutionary transformation. That's much easier. So why the heck do I use this long word? Well, because there is no adjective from rebirth.
Because you're in Oxford. That's why I use that word. That's a
No.
joke.
Well, yeah, it is what the French call a professional deformation. But I mean, you can't be a medic without using funny words for it. And so I saw my doctorate as partly technical. It wasn't an exercise in journalism. But I needed an adjective that went with nationalism to distinguish it from other forms of nationalism. Well, I could define fascist nationalism from other forms of nationalism by calling it ultra-nationalism. Now, there's a big meaning in that ultra. It comes from the Latin for beyond. It's beyond liberalism. It's illiberal. It's anti-liberal. It does not believe in social equality or everybody having an equal vote or even in a democratic system. And it also means not only is it illiberal, but it can be transnational. It can actually form bonds with other forms of extreme nationalism. So there's a transnational dimension to fascist nationalism. So, for example, when Mussolini and Hitler created the Axis, that was no contradiction of their nationalism because they recognized a common cause in having common enemies. So we're getting somewhere. So the mythic core, the driving image of fascism is a reborn, organic, non-liberal nation, undemocratic of course, any system can claim to be democratic because it involves the forces of the people. But nevertheless, so we've got the mythic core of fascism is a palingenetic form of populist ultranationalism. It's a bit like making curry. These are all the ingredients. The populism means it's not just a despotic system where the ruler makes diktats down to the people like Saddam Hussein or al-Assad or whatever.
And wants a quiet populace, right? They want to mobilize populace.
Yeah, exactly. It wants to mobilize the people, the masses. It is essential to fascism that it is not just a personal dictatorship based on despotism. It has to somehow engage people power. So we're nearly getting there. And the final bit of the jigsaw is in its various permutations. The definition recognizes that it takes many different forms, that there is no archetypal fascism. Like not every fascism is a version of Mussolini's fascism or Hitler's fascism. So let's go through that again. Fascism is a political ideology whose mythic core in its various permutations is a palingenetic form of populist ultranationalism. So when you distill that out, and then you look at, say, Italian fascism, what you find, not only was it revolutionary in the sense that it could get into total power in 1925, it got rid of the entire democratic system and replaced it with a centralized democracy, what under Lenin is called democratic centralism. But this is not the communist version. This is a nationalist version. But massive attempts were made to mobilize the people, mass organizations, mass speeches, lots of exhibitions and sporting events. You know, there was a massive attempt to use the Italian people, whip them up into the sort of frenzy or sense of community you get during the Olympics or during the World Cup football or whatever. They want to keep the people power bubbling along constantly. This is the fascist goal. And then when you look at Nazism, which of course is totally different from Italian fascism, it's got all sorts of components that Italian fascism doesn't have. In particular, rabid eugenic anti-Semitism and concentration camps, etc. Nevertheless, if you look at the core myth of Nazism, it wants a reborn Germany, which will replace the Weimar Republic, make the country great again. Sorry, that does not mean Trump is a fascist, by the way, but we've got Putin making Russia great again. Greatness is not a definition of fascism, but the idea of rebirth, that Germany was great, was defeated in the First World War, went into democratic chaos in Weimar, and is now being reborn as an organic community which excludes other people. Or the idea that modern Italy was weak and kicked around like a football in international politics, but is now reawakening with the original primordial energy of the Roman Empire, the energy that created the Catholic Church, the energy that created a Renaissance, and is becoming great again because the Italians are modern Romans. These are absolutely typical fascist myths of rebirth. And when you look at all the different fascisms, you will find in every single one in the interwar period an equivalent myth, very different, very culture specific, but the idea of a reborn people guided into a new order by a charismatic leader, or would be. Some of them were very uncharismatic.
Yes. I think your initial point there about the transformational aspect of it, a revolutionary movement. So it's not conservative. It wants to create a new order.
It's what some fascists actually call a conservative revolutionary. Now, that is very confusing for a lot of people because they think that conservatism always wants to go back. But there's a wonderful book actually called The Third Reich by Müller von den Bruck, a German conservative. And he says the eternal values of conservatives cannot be resuscitated in their original form, like in the Middle Ages. We have to go forward to go back. There's a fantastic German phrase for anybody who's listening in German, eine Wiederanknüpfung nach vorwärts, a reconnection forwards. So conservative revolutionary thinking says you have to create a new order to resuscitate and re-establish the eternal values. So you don't want to literally go back to the Romans or the Aryans, or if you're a Norwegian fascist, to the Vikings or whatever, but you want to take the eternal spirit. And I'm sure some real fascist Americans believe that there is an eternal American spirit. They don't want to go back to the 17th century, but they do want that original spirit in a new order, which embraces iPhones and technology and guns and everything else. It's a conservatism which is a futural conservatism.
From reading my Evans and Kershaw, I learned that to understand Nazism, you have to see it as a movement that does look back and ahead. Here is, before we get to my Putin questions, this is how I define fascism. A political and social movement that exalts the nation above all else, thereby marginalizing personal freedoms and civil liberties. Fascism requires extreme regimentation of nearly all aspects of public life. Politically, it is defined by one-party dictatorial rule without free elections or oppositional parties, heavily reliant on a mobilized public, as you just mentioned. And in a 20th century German context, Nazism was characterized by an obsession with race and war of national aggrandizement. It was a revolutionary movement, and violence is indispensable to fascism. It's not an option. You have any bones to pick with my wordy definition?
Well, it's pretty good. I'd give you a sort of alpha beta for that. I mean, yeah, very good. Except that until you put in this rider at the end about revolutionary movement, you are really creating a general characterization of many interwar authoritarian regimes. And I'll give you a classic one, is Franco's Spain. Now, of course, if you're a Marxist, and this is something I wanted to make sure your listeners are hearing, because some of them will be tearing their hair out or will have already turned off, because if you come to all this from the Marxist left, everything I'm saying is sort of typical bourgeois wishy-washiness, because actually Marxists know that fascism is in some way or other, the expression of capitalism in crisis. Capitalism with its backs against the wall, threatened by social breakdown and the workers' movement, or by the threat of Bolshevism, which then uses nationalism cynically as a way to whip up anti-Bolshevik, anti-socialist demands and revolutionary energies, and basically tries to enlist populist energies to preserve the capitalist system from destruction. And that obviously, if you are a Marxist, that is a sufficient definition. And from that point of view, Franco is a fascist. Franco is a fascist because there was a lot of popular unrest in the interwar period. The left-wing government that was elected, I think, in 1931, though it had its liberals, was also quite rooted in the working class movement and in Marxist ideas and in what was called national syndicalism and anarcho-syndicalism. And therefore, Franco was basically a front of a reactionary counter-revolutionary movement in Spain to make sure that the landed classes and the bourgeoisie did not have their property and their power taken away from them. But from my point of view, what is very clear, if we push on this idea of a revolutionary nationalism, was that Franco actually never wanted a new Spain. He wanted an old Spain under modern management with no fundamental social revolution. Whereas if you read the works of Primo de Rivera before he was killed, the leader of the Falange or Falange, he wanted a new Spain. So what actually happens when you've got a fascist movement within a modernizing conservative movement. Well, Franco, during the Civil War, enlists and integrates the phalangists as very good fighters into his own forces. But immediately after he realizes that Hitler and Mussolini are not going to win, he then drops the phalange and moves back to a base in the Catholic Church, the extreme radical conservatism of the Catholics. So that by 1945, there's no idea of America occupying Spain or anything at the end of the war. Spain joins NATO, it has NATO bases, it has a limited involvement in capitalism, it builds motorways, and it gets through the war with the Spanish people unoccupied and unfought. Franco, therefore, was a modernizing conservative, and it was the phalange that was fascist. So if you ever want to test somebody to see where they are on fascism, ask them about the Spanish Civil War. Now, of course, having said that, thousands of wonderfully brave Americans went out to Spain, famously, to form legions to fight Franco, and they were absolutely convinced they were fighting fascism. And that seemed more likely because the Franco regime was backed by Mussolini and Hitler, and it was Hitler's Condor legions that bombed Guernica and inspired Picasso's painting. So is a half-truth in the fact that it was a showdown between fascism and communism. Having said that, paradoxically, Franco himself, according to the Griffin definition, which is now very widespread, was not technically a fascist.
I haven't done enough reading about Italian fascism either, which is, of course, the country where it began, fascismo. But something you pointed out in your initial book way back in the early 1990s that never really occurred to me, but when I read it, I said, oh yeah, you know what? That's right. Fascism never had any major theorists who rank along with Locke or Marx in their respective ideologies.
I mean, fascism is to be seen more as a narrative than an ideology. You find the raw material for understanding the fascist worldview less in theory, but very much in speeches, propaganda, posters, images, letters. I mean, Mussolini's collected works are, I think, 27 volumes, Omnia Opera. I mean, it's just incredible. Don't forget, Mussolini was a journalist. Yes. He created this brilliantly entitled Popolo Italiano, the Italian people, where people could originally mean the Marxist people, the proletariat. He started off as a Marxist, but by the end it meant this national community. And he wrote articles every day, he gave thousands of speeches, and he did occasionally, as in the Italian Encyclopedia of 1932, knock out definitions. In that definition, there's a very interesting passage where he says, when you're carrying out a nationalist revolution, you haven't got time to sit around theorizing about it. You know what it is. I mean, what it is creating this new nation. And then you can sit down and rationalize it. What fascism does in practice is rationalize itself by drawing on useful intellectuals. And there is no shortage of these intellectuals because you actually get, for example, in Italy, a major philosopher called Giovanni Gentile, who's a Hegelian philosopher, who has a really complicated theory of state, which says basically this wonderful Hegelian paradox that you're only free in a totalitarian state. We don't need to go into that. And there were thousands of intellectuals, for example, who were working on the theory of corporatist economics, which was very influential after the war, and there's a thing called neo-corporatism. And there were lots and lots of people. There was millions of words being generated, but they were not hardcore theoreticians. And certainly the fascist regime didn't base itself on a particular theory. If you go to Nazism, you have some very high-powered rationalizers of Nazism, like Carl Schmitt, who was a legal theorist, extraordinarily Germanic and dense legal theory. And you have somebody like Heidegger, the philosopher, who ended up thinking that Nazism was the cure to the problems of modernity, etc. But where you go for the theory are in the people drawing up the Nazi legal system and the Nazi constitutions and all the statements about, for example, there was an actual theory of the Führerprinzip, the principle of the leader, which replaced the democratic, I mean, it was all codified and rationalized. So it's absolutely wrong to think of fascism as not having a very serious and heavy and often very boringly complicated theoretical underpinning. What it doesn't have is a sort of 19th century hero that they can go back to.
To your initial point about mobilizing the nation, Mussolini and Hitler both viewed human existence the role of the nation as part of a competition, right? Peaceful coexistence. We often use that term nowadays as some goal we want to achieve in the world. But they were never interested in that. They felt like you were either conquering or being conquered. And in the Nazi context, that had a very social, Darwinistic, racist connotation.
Yeah. Well, there's a very good example of how Nazism is a scavenger in the dustbins of 19th century theory. It took on board eugenics and racism and social anthropology. It created a new discipline called racial anthropology. And another part of what was sort of in the air was the idea of social Darwinism, eugenic Darwinism, struggle between nations and races being in a hierarchy of valuable and not valuable. In fact, if you read Mein Kampf, which it's very interesting, isn't it? I literally believe that if people had taken Mein Kampf seriously, they would have seen if it wasn't a blueprint, gave a very good idea. It sketched out the framework for Nazi ambitions and foreign policy. And similarly, if Putin's speeches had been listened to more carefully, I think NATO would have been arming Ukraine probably from 2014, if not before. But that's another story about...
That's the old structuralist versus intentionalist debate. We don't need to get into that here, right?
No, we don't need to get into that. But yes, it's absolutely true that interwar fascism, I say interwar because there are modern versions or variants of fascism which use extreme euphemism to conceal their belief in strife. But let's stick to the interwar period. And it's absolutely true. It's called a topos. One of the topoi, one of the recurrent themes of all fascists is the fallacy of eternal peace, the fallacy of social democracy and a brotherhood of nations and a sort of alliance of the good, etc., etc. That nations are organic entities. They're like people and they can have decadent bits. I'll give you a terrifying quote from Auschwitz where a woman doctor, a Jewess, was in the camp and was actually talking to a Nazi doctor and said, "How can you do this to us? You've taken a Hippocratic oath." And the Auschwitz doctor said, "But I am fulfilling my Hippocratic oath. I am cutting out the diseased liver of Europe." Yes. The Jews represent the diseased organ. So there's your organic thinking. So from a fascist point of view, peace makes nations weak and decadent. Materialism makes it decadent. Individualism is atomism. It breaks everything apart. What you need are these organic entities which in the literary imagination exists in Norse myths and legends and the Mahabharata or Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, where you have a sort of armies of people and their deaths sort of are all... The individual deaths are part of epic phenomena which dwarf the significance of an individual death. That an individual death is only significant to the point where it plays a part in a cosmic drama. And if you die in a healthy cause, you are immortal. And if you die as a member of a decadent community, your death is unimportant. What's called Manichaean division between meaningful death and meaningless death.
In the Nazi worldview, the very existence, the mere existence of a certain race, the Jews and others, was a threat to the master race. And about your comment about this myth of a unified national community, I think that's why in Leni Riefenstahl's famous movie, the masses were moving in sync as one.
It's a terrifying moment at the opening of the Triumph of the Will. Never underestimate the intelligence of fascists. I mean, what people tend to confuse intellect and intelligence with humanism and being nice. I mean, Machiavelli was brilliant, and we could go on. But the Riefenstahl opens her film with Hitler in a plane, reliving the flight of Woden or Wotan over the clouds with Wagnerian tones in the music. And they then go through the clouds and they see Nuremberg. And when they look at Nuremberg, what you see is a column of ants in a complete straight line, turning right with a geometrical turn. When you get a bit closer, these are soldiers who are walking towards the Nuremberg Stadium, where it's all going to take place. And there are crowds saluting them, but the masses have been turned into regimented forces for the nation. To that extent, we're not just talking about the regimentation of human society, but the militarization. So that human beings, if you're a male, you have to have a warrior inside you. And if you're a woman, you have to have a mother inside you. There's total gender polarity. Both genders are given back their dignity and valued, but valued for their biologically ordained, nationally ordained tasks. And therefore, you're absolutely right. Interwar fascism posits the idea that war is a competition. I mean, there's this terrible phrase that might is right, that in a way, it's a bit like a sort of racial World Cup. And there's a sort of tragic undertone to all this, that nations come and go, that you can look at the ruins of, say, the Romans and the Greeks and say they were great. And we want to, I call it the Baedeker theory of Nazism. And Baedeker was a famous published guide to cities. And Hitler and Mussolini wanted to be remembered in generations' time from the achievements of the architecture and the battles and how much they'd conquered, to be looked back as modern Romans, modern Greeks, cultural, warrior-like, leaving a huge impact on history and then passing back into oblivion, but remembered as sort of epic people like the Mayans. And yes. In fact, when Hitler opens the motorway system, there's a reference in the commentary to the Mayan. This is the modern equivalent of the Mayan civilization, which I find a really revealing trope about how the historical imagination is pointed forward.
To your point, it is wrong to just dismiss figures such as the Nazis and Mussolini as mindless, blowhard, evil monsters, although in many respects they were. Yes, they were intelligent, not to pass them a compliment. They understood the uses of mass media. They were master propagandists. They were able to whip up, in the Nazis' case, an economically advanced, scientific civilization. Because war for them, at least in the Nazis' case, was about race. It was a race war of annihilation. We think of the Holocaust, obviously, but we often
But also the invasion of Russia was a racial war.
The hunger plan, right? The idea was to starve tens of millions of people to death.
Some of your listeners remember the third part of Tolkien's trilogy, the massive battles at the end of history. These are apocalyptic battles. It's in the Mahabharata, it's in the Norse myths and legends, it's probably in part of male mythology all over the world. In big battles, there are individual tragedies, you get that in Shakespeare, but there is a sort of tide of history, and every individual becomes a wave or a ripple in this big movement of that. And that is the fascist viewpoint. Paradoxically, Mussolini and Hitler did not see themselves just as creating an autocracy of personal dictatorship. And I'm not sure to what extent Napoleon ever thought forward properly, but even he tried to create a dynasty. But Mussolini and Hitler wanted to actually transform. There's a wonderful Marxist theorist called Walter Benjamin. He talks about exploding the continuum of history. He uses that phrase in the context of Marxism. But I think that fascist leaders in the interwar period, in the front, of course, Mussolini and Hitler, but all their epigones, all the imitators and followers-on leaders wanted to be part of a huge explosion of history to put it into a new track. The track would be towards a heroic nationalism, which would embrace technology. The Nazis planned an elaborate motorway system all the way to the Ural Mountains because they had to get the corn and the production back into Germany. There was no contradiction between Nazism and modernity. If you think of modern China now, modern China has shown that you can have an extremely successful manufacturing system without any of the individualistic democratic underpinning that we thought went hand in hand with it in the West. There was a huge Nazi and fascist cult of modernity. It was the fascists in Italy who electrified the railways, created the first motorway system, and experimented with a new economic system called corporatism, invented rayon, had a cult of aviation and aeroplanes. I mean, what is anti-modern about this? It's anti the Western democratic capitalist model, but it's still absolutely modern. And that is why, for example, in Italy, futurist painters and poets celebrated fascism as for its pure dynamism, in contrast to the blah, blah, blah of democracy where nothing ever happens. And I believe that one of the advantages for listeners now, having lived, I hope it is permanently in the past, through the Trump era and are now living through the Putin era, can actually see how the myth that you are regenerating, revitalizing the country and trying to restore a certain greatness can actually have a powerful populist appeal if people feel alienated enough from the system under which they live. Tragically, a lot of ordinary Russians of a certain generation, a certain age, see Putin as a charismatic leader who's making Russia great again. What's interesting is that the younger generation that is plugged into social media, etc., do not buy the Putin myth, but an older generation, like an older generation of white Americans, could buy the idea their nation is a sort of organism which is decaying, which is sick and needs to be made healthy again through a strong human being who defies all the conventions and does it his way, to quote the Frank Sinatra song.
But at the same time, I don't want to overrate how intelligent Hitler may have been.
No.
He's a mediocre.
There are many intelligences. You see, the trouble is we have an academic-based idea of intelligence in the West, where if you're a Harvard professor, you're intelligent. But if you're just a script writer in Hollywood, you're somehow not intelligent. I mean, I think there's supreme intelligence and stupidity in every sphere of life. And you can have really bum film scripts and you can have really thick politicians. And I've met some very stupid academics. But so I think there is a type of intelligence in reading the mood of the people. I think that Hitler was absolutely bang on. I think to a degree Trump was, through the fog of his underdeveloped mind. There was a sense that there was a segment of the population ripe for change that were alienated and lost in the status quo, and that the time was ripe for something outrageous. I mean, Mussolini in 1919 creates this thing called the League of Combatants, or the League of Veterans, and takes on the government, gets nowhere at all, but he keeps going with the sort of monomania that you get in future fascist leaders, is quite ready to compromise some of his own ideas by becoming head of state, when really he wanted to get rid of democracy altogether, chooses his moment. And then what's really interesting, he has attracted enough administrators and intellectuals and journalists and doers and organizers and civil servants of quality to actually, within 5 years, create a functioning economy and a real sense, a very powerful sense of popular consensus. By 1932, I tell you, the culminating moment, which is still chilling, he sends an army to Ethiopia. He uses mustard gas. He drops bombs on Abyssinians barefoot and carrying spears. It's all sort of filmed and edited in a particular way. And then in 1936, he stands at his balcony near the Forum, next to the Monument of the Nation, with an absolutely packed square below, and just says, Ethiopia is Italian. And the people go bonkers.
Yes.
They go completely out of... So he had the intelligence to know what a certain segment of a population desperately wants, against the background of the international depression and poverty, etc., that actually the peasants didn't need food and refrigerators. They needed to feel great about who they were, and they would somehow worship the nation, and some of them would be ready to die for it. And you get the same sense in every fascist movement, that they're trying to stir up a sort of heroic sense in every member of the nation, that they weren't just individuals, that they were part of this epic story of the nation. And that rhetoric still has power today.
I think it's wrong to view Mussolini as a buffoon. The historian Zara Steiner, the late historian Zara Steiner, in her great works on the interwar period, shows how, well, to use that word, intelligent Mussolini was as an operator. But about Hitler, he was, in many ways, beneath mediocre. I mean, he was the Bohemian corporal. He wasn't very well educated. He wasn't very well read, but he was a supreme agitator. He did have a talent there. But both men, Mussolini and Hitler, were unbelievably stupid in taking on the Western world in a world war.
They had a very limited reality principle. Yes. Mind you, I could say that about many major politicians.
Not just fascists.
I mean, look, if you look at the history of the Vietnam War, there is an incredible corporate stupidity it's called the sunk cost fallacy, that you've just got to keep going to the bitter end.
And Robert McNamara was what? He the best and the brightest, right?
Leaders, even democratic leaders, can tend to enter a tunnel vision where they're in denial, that they don't dare back out, that they don't dare lose face, and they feel that by pouring resources and human resources into a futile cause, they can somehow win it. So I don't think it's peculiar to fascism, this. And look at the miscalculations of Bolsheviks, or look at the organized insanity of North Korea in its worldview. I don't know. Yeah, stupidity is the wrong word. I mean, I just think that there's something about the psychology of somebody who wants to be a leader, and not just in order to be corrupt and have lots of villas and stuff. Like Ceausescu was just corrupt. I mean,
Yes.
I went to Ceausescu, the Romanian dictator's villa, just after he disappeared, and I saw the gold. The wife didn't like gold, so she had silver taps and he had gold taps. And he was just like a decadent Roman emperor. But I think you've got to see fascism as not just self-indulgent decadence. These are people who wanted to somehow leave a mark. They had a deep sense that by resolving what they saw as the decadence of their nation, they would write their own heroic history.
Yes, that's what makes them so dangerous.
And die great. And there's this myth of greatness. And I see it very much in terms of a post-religious age where there is a permanent existential crisis, where millions of people have very little sense of destiny or purpose. And some people lock into, say, driving sports cars as quickly as possible. And some people get high on politics and get high on that sense of power you can get from politics, and to have a genuine sense that destiny, providence is calling upon them to solve the problems of the nation. And they develop visceral hatreds. And then, of course, if they get into power and have the levers of power, and they become, I mean, for example, look at the intelligence of Hitler in bringing, any modern dictator has a problem with the army. The armies tend to be originally subordinate to a democratic nation. So how do you bring them on board? Well, there was a single flag that had got blood on it in the failed putsch of November 1923.
Should have been the end of his career, but go ahead.
Yeah, it should have been, but he didn't get the bullet, unfortunately. And he should have been hanged, but he was instead given a nice room with a lot of writing paper and a typewriter and dictated Mein Kampf. And then, because of the Wall Street crash, and that's all your fault in America there, you called in all the loans, and Weimar collapses, and you suddenly got a vacuum that is filled by Nazism, etc., etc. Well, how do you get the German army? These were Prussian-trained patriots. Well, he used the Blutfahne, the blood flag, so that every member of the German army had to make an oath to the nation and Hitler and kiss the blood flag. And this had a transformative effect on every individual soldier. The intelligence of fascist leaders lies in their ability to enact fascism. They stage it, they stage manage it. It's a bit like the intelligence you need to organize a Billie Eilish concert. That there is a fantastic intelligence in the lighting, in the staging, in the way you sequence the songs. Now that is, you try and do it if you don't know anything about music or staging. And there is that intelligence, which is supreme intelligence. And the trouble with, I mean, there's a phrase in English, the devil knows the best tunes. And fascism was much better at selling itself than democracy in the interwar period. In fact, there's a very interesting passage in Mein Kampf where he says, you know, the extraordinary thing about these communists is even though they are despicable, they really know how to, well, in a sense, it's like saying they know how to organize a party, but a political party. He said, look at all the flags, look at the way they whip up the masses. He says, a communist rally makes the little worm in each individual feel he is part of a great dragon.
So Hitler liked the red of the communist symbols.
He liked the red and he put it with the black and he designs the swastika. But my point is to recognize by staging a fascist event properly, the little worm, the lost little impotent nothing inside each person felt they were part of a great dragon.
So, Timothy Snyder, historian here in the United States, writing in the New York Times, says, a time traveler from the 1930s would have no difficulty identifying the Putin regime as fascist. The symbol Z, the rallies, the propaganda, the war as a cleansing act of violence and the death pits around Ukrainian towns make it all very plain. He goes on to say the war against Ukraine is not only a return to the traditional fascist battleground, but also a return to traditional fascist language and practice. Other people are there to be colonized. Russia is innocent because of its ancient past. The existence of Ukraine is an international conspiracy. War is the answer. What does Roger Griffin think of that?
Well, Roger Griffin says that when in the same article, Snyder claims that there is no commonly accepted definition of fascism, he's just ignorant or he's lying or whatever. I mean, there's an entire school of thought, extremely well established with many hundreds and thousands of words and hundreds of articles, and which says actually there is a widely accepted definition of fascism. Now, you can disagree with it, but you can't say it doesn't exist. Incidentally, Madeleine Albright, in her Warning from History, Fascism, says the same thing. There is no definition of fascism. There is a definition of fascism. Now, he can choose to redefine it. There is no objective, ultimate, definitive, essentialist definition of fascism. If he wants to use another one, he's fine. But let's go back over what he says. Absolutely right. There are massive things reminiscent of fascism, akin to fascism. Certainly the idea of a humiliated nation trying to restore a sense of greatness and power. Absolutely bang on. If you look at Nazism, you look at Italian fascism, even though it was on the winning side, it had what they called in Italy a mutilated victory. If you look at the anxieties, existential anxieties of the fascist leaders in Spain and Britain, etc., absolutely true. But if we actually start looking at it as an academic discipline, more and more people, and that doesn't make it true, it just makes it useful, it's called heuristically useful, see fascism as distinguished from other forms of illiberal politics by its core rebirth myth, which involves a transformation of the status quo, a new order. Now, there is no evidence at all that Putin, or Trump for that matter, wanted to actually create a new constitutional order with themselves as a sole dictator. In fact, you could say that on the day of the Capitol rebellion, you could say that one scenario was that Trump would declare himself dictator of America, but I find that very unconvincing. I think
there's no legal basis for it, right?
He wanted to prove that the election had been stolen. Well, the fact is that if you look at Hitler and Mussolini, they didn't want to be bound by the constitution or operate through a democratic constitution. Putin went to enormous trouble to perpetuate his own hold on power, but he never tried to actually change the constitution to the point of abolishing the facade of democracy. And I think this is very significant. He is an illiberal democrat. He has completely taken the liberalism out of democracy, but he has not tried to replace parliamentary Russia with a different Russia. He's perverted the parliamentary process. He uses aspects of a totalitarian regime, but I don't see any evidence that he can be directly identified with the radicalness of the Nazi or fascist revolution, which was an attempt to create a new era based on the collapse of Western liberal democracy and the institution of a new era in history. And I think ultimately Putin is in the sequence of Russian autocrats who now is operating a modern Russia with modern weapons and a modern public and modern media, but he's ultimately sees himself as a modern Peter the Great rather than a modern Hitler.
I'm not sure he's aiming to colonize Ukraine. I mean, there's been an enormous amount of destruction, death, misery, people forced into refugee status. The Russian war is a monstrous crime, but he does not see the Ukrainians as Untermensch, as Hitler saw.
No, he sees the Ukraine as a sort of fake nation. It's not a real nation, and it would become even more of an unreal nation if it was part of NATO and the EU. Ukraine is a sort of geographical expression, and historically it was bound up with Great Russia, and it was under Stalin. And Ukraine had a destiny either to recognize its identity with Russia or to follow the logic of Nazism and the EU and the West and somehow turn against Russia. And so Russia has a right to crush this fake nation and stop it being taken hostage by NATO and the EU, which would bring the enemy of the West right up to the borders. Now, this is all, yes, I think that in terms of in many aspects, the psychology of Putin as a fanatical leader is extremely analogous to elements of Mussolini and elements of Hitler, but also elements of Stalin and elements of other psychotic leaders who lose touch with reality. And
a lot of this stuff is not unique to fascism that we're talking about.
No, absolutely. That isn't unique to fascism. But my main point academically, and this is purely academic, it makes very good journalistic article. I mean, if you judge reality by how it looks, he's dead right. It's deeply reminiscent of elements of the Second World War. But if you're going to claim that fascism does not have a fairly agreed academic meaning, I'm afraid that's a misspeak.
For the people being killed, maybe motivation of their attackers doesn't matter, right? What does it matter?
No, absolutely not.
But for our purposes here, It matters. Motivations are critical. Yet, Roger Griffin, I go back and forth with this in my own mind. What does it matter? I can hear some of my listeners right now, and they might be saying, well, what does this really matter? And I would say, well, it matters and it doesn't matter. I mean, we do have to understand definitions and political ideologies if we're going to have a discussion about what's going on in the world. We also don't want to get trapped into definitions.
Well, absolutely. And I totally agree with that. And I think that any student or academic should actually take the trouble to do a good survey of what's being done about fascism before they say there's no definition and it's up for grabs and whatever. So that's just about good scholarly method. But I'll tell you why I think it does matter. I think it matters to make sense of who Putin is and what his motivation is, because if that had been understood earlier in the run-up to the Crimean annexation, instead of trying to woo him with greater economic and commercial integration into the West, instead of trying to make Europe dependent on oil, instead of saying, well, look, he won't want any more than this, which is deeply reminiscent of saying that Hitler would stop with the Sudeten Germans and with Austria, then they got Putin wrong. Now, Putin experts, and they are not academic experts necessarily, though some of them are. A lot of them are just very, very good journalists. A lot of them are actually based in the Ukraine and in Russia and in personalities like Navalny. If you asked anybody who really knew about Putin and who's followed his career through, they would tell you that after 2007 and the international crisis of capitalism, there was a fundamental change of Putin's personality and goals. And that from 2007, he had a different vision of himself. His original idea was to actually make Russia powerful among modern capitalist nations. They had the oil, they had the technology, they had the industry, and it was a question about taking on the West in its own game as an advanced industrial nation. But after 2007, Putin actually starts Plan B, and Plan B is to recapture the sense of greatness that he grew up with under the Russian Soviet Empire, and that Crimea is the culmination of that, and that if you actually followed his speeches and the sort of people he was gathering around him, and if you look at the logic of a very important ideologue of Russian Putinism, a Eurasianist called Alexander Dugin, you would actually see that there was an alternative vision of the future of Russia taking shape, which became enacted with the annexation of Crimea, which was the idea of trying to bring former Soviet satellites back into the orbit of Russia and to punish those who did not. And by making the West dependent on its gas and oil, Putin could see a lever there for gaining non-democratic power as an industrial nation. And I think he came very unstuck with his invasion of Ukraine because he'd overestimated the power of the Russian army. But he's still pursuing the idea that if you cannot annex Ukraine, then you destroy it, because he's not interested in a new Russia, but he is interested in a Russia, as with his involvement in Syria, he wants Russia to be respected not as a democratic humanistic power, but just as naked power, as a Russia that doesn't give a damn about international rules and regulations or human life, and it should just basically not be discounted. He's like a sort of overlooked lover who burns the car of the new wife just out of sheer, as if to say, I'm still here.
Now, he would point to the United States and Iraq in 2003 to say, well, the democracies aren't going to play by the rules
Absolutely.
either.
Absolutely. He can quote case after case of that. Look at the prison system in America if you're going to start talking about human rights, etc. I mean, it's very easy to point to the hypocrisy of the West.
Putin, Mussolini, Hitler all benefited from being underestimated by their opponents. You mentioned Alexander Dugin as we wrap up here. He was quoted in a New York Times article recently as saying in 2014, only after restoring the greater Russia that is the Eurasian Union, we can become a credible global player. The Ukrainian revolt against Russian influence that year, 2014, Dugin called a coup d'etat by the United States. So, I always thought that he was a shrewd, clever operator, and he was. But he did He made a massive miscalculation here. Although I had Max Hastings and Anthony Beaver on this podcast fairly recently, they both believe that Russia at some point here is going to blast its way to something it can call victory.
Well, I mean, there's a thing called a Pyrrhic victory, where you destroy yourself in the pursuit of the victory.
And destroy everything in their path. I mean, Mariupol has been reduced to rubble.
I'd like to throw in 2 points from the point about the problem of modeling what's going on in Russia. Russia lost 22 million people in the Second World War. Its self-salvation through the Red Army, which committed terrible atrocities on the way, rape and pillage and torture on the way to Berlin. Nevertheless, it was it was a war based entirely on sacrifice. There's a film called Enemy at the Gates, if you ever want a little sample of that, which is really important. So if you're Russian and you look at history from a Russian perspective, the cult of the individual and democracy and freedom and the Enlightenment, they never had an Enlightenment. They never had democracy. People quote people like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, etc., but read through Western eyes, we can appropriate them into Western literature, but these are deeply Russian novels, Russian ways of thinking. And so the caring about the minutiae of individual human rights and lives is alien to the Russian perspective on history. History is made up of huge tidal tsunami processes which dwarf individual fates and importances. And there are these massive moments of starvation and famine and death and gulags, etc., etc. So we must be very careful not to impose on our understanding of Russia a sort of Western perspective cultivated in Harvard and Oxford, etc. Point one. Point two, and this really is the closing of the loop of this podcast, is that if you actually look at Alexander Dugin very carefully, and one of my great colleagues, a Ukrainian intellectual and Putin watcher called Anton Shekpotsov, who has podcasts and stuff on the web, and another one called Andreas Umland, who is very active on social media about Putin and Russia. He is German, Russian, English speaking. Both see Dugin as a fascist. Dugin has said he's a fascist. He is quite clear about his debt to French fascism and the French New Right. And though he's not a direct influence on Putin, he certainly, his vision of a Eurasian destiny, that Russia has a separate destiny from the West, which you get in Dostoevsky, which you get in all the Russian intellectuals, that Russia is partly Western, partly humanistic, partly Enlightenment, but partly Asian, partly, if you like, barbaric, partly outside the fold of Western nations, is crucial to understanding the perspective of anti-democrats. I mean, if you talk to Navalny about this, you'd see that Navalny identifies with Western ideas of individualism and human rights. And there are wonderful, wonderful, heroic people who are suffering for that as I speak. But there is a terrifying component of the Russian populace and the Russian ruling elites who really don't get this Western obsession with human rights and the importance of human life.
Roger Griffin, author of The Nature of Fascism, we thank you for your insights. On the next episode of History as It Happens, we just had the 50th anniversary of the Watergate break-in, an event that led to the downfall of a president.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Richard Nixon was never charged with a crime, and as the January 6 hearings continue, some are asking if Donald Trump would become the first former president to face criminal charges. That's next when we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.